Hi everyone, I'm John Foran, and I'd like to welcome you to this portion of our conference, which is a panel with several talks called Creating a Field. And this refers to the emerging field of climate justice studies, which myself and a number of colleagues here at UC Santa Barbara and elsewhere are trying to give some momentum to in the academy, a scholar activist in particular. My talk, my own talk, is how can we create the new field of climate justice studies? The present moment strikes me as extremely dangerous, calling for our immediate attention, as the academy, like humanity itself, now must scramble and mobilize to address the existential question of climate change, and with urgency. The current generation of adults, people between, say, 35 and 99, has failed, both in our activism and in our scholarship. So it's been left to a new generation of younger scholars and activist intellectuals to develop the tools that we need to trace the contours of such a new field going forward. A deeper understanding of the intertwined social, political, economic, and cultural aspects of the climate crisis, and a correspondingly stronger and more sociological approach to the complexities of climate justice and the movements that bear this name. In other words, I'm calling on this generation of scholars and its allies, now all of us, say from 18 up, and younger than 18 in some cases, to rise to the occasion and to forge a completely new understanding within every subfield of sociology and across all the social sciences into the humanities, whose innovators I consider my own close allies in this, and for that matter, all the fields of the natural sciences, engineering, and education, both in the university and among public and movement intellectuals. So the question I'd like to raise now is, what are some of the specific contributions that we can make to create the field of a climate justice studies that would be at once exciting and politically relevant to the real world? The simple facts require this. Readily available climate science is extremely clear that business as usual, global economic models of the current phase of capitalist globalization are leading us into a future marked by the boundaries of a zone somewhere between extremely dangerous and chaotic degrees of climate change. Climate science has established the threshold of 1.5 degrees as the safest upper warming limit for hopefully staving off chaos in the Earth's system. And this is no doubt true, considering the growing climate disruption as the world now blows past merely the 1 degree mark. Elementary social science suggests that our own and subsequent decades will witness increasingly dangerous social consequences, including massive migrations of people away from flooded coastal cities, escalating wars and other forms of violence over food, land, and water, and quite possibly the end of democracy in any of the forms we know it today, toward ever more authoritarian, intrusive, militarized states across most of the globe. Does this sound impossible or just improbable? Well, let's ask, what kind of carbon budget keeps us under 1.5 degrees? If we want odds of 66%, climate scientists tell us we'll burn through that budget in less than 4 business as usual years. I love how they can quantify this. Who among us would try to cross a road with such odds of not getting hit by a car? If we prefer, say, an 80 or 90% chance, which is still Russian roulette odds, the budget shrinks considerably, and the window we have to be at zero emissions is maybe 2 or 3 years under business as usual conditions. Thus, my plea that the academic world wake up. Why not dedicate our efforts now to this civilizational crisis? And that means pretty much dropping business as usual scholarship in the business as usual university, and instead directly helping to bring about a massive transformational mobilization of education at every level, both qualitatively in what and how we teach, and quantitatively in terms of opening wide the doors of higher education to all that it currently excludes. Let's call these hard physical limits to the Earth system the natural foundation of the new sociology of climate change. What then might a sociology of climate justice look like? For my part, that story points to two main areas: a sociology of the crisis itself and a sociology of all the movements which are seeking to address the crisis. The sociology we now need may be defined as the study of everything about this crisis and its possible trajectories. And the first principle of this sociology would be that everything is connected to everything else. Curiously, perhaps, this would be one way of stating the first principle of ecology, or, for that matter, the worldview of Buddhism. Here are some of the characteristics of such a sociology of the crisis. We are in a state of multiple crises. One way to think of the present moment and the foreseeable future is as a triple crisis involving capitalist globalization, the fraying limits of formal representative democracy, and the pervasive violence that seeps throughout and into our cultures. We're thus living through several profound deteriorations in the quality of life on Earth simultaneously. We have a deep and persistent economic crisis manifest in global economic uncertainty and horrifically unequal access to well-being in the current period, including vast gender, racial, ethnic, and national disparities. We have a crisis of democracy as governments and political parties fail to live up to public expectations in many regions of the world. And I first wrote these lines on the eve of the US presidential elections of 2016, which is strong evidence for this claim. We have the violence and militarism that saturate the global economy and everything from our most intimate relationships to the ways that this militarism drives both the economic crisis and the democratic deficit. The nodes of this triple crisis are bound together and in turn greatly exacerbated by the likelihood of climate chaos. This interdependency of the several crises means that we need holistic relational analysis and visionary transboundary scholarship to understand and confront climate change and to create the conditions for climate justice. This is significant. It means that we need to learn to connect the dots in confronting the climate crisis, and this in turn leads us to the necessary breaking down of all disciplinary boundaries in our paths. A second point of departure for understanding the crisis is to allow and test the proposition that the climate crisis is a crisis of capitalism, and indeed could well prove to be its final insurmountable crisis. Here we come to the economic bedrock of the current situation as named by Naomi Klein in her aptly titled landmark book, This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. The multiple ongoing crises of neoliberal capitalism are mostly the effects of its normal operation. In the last third of a century, the rampant privatization of public goods and services has generated both obscene inequality and unparalleled concentrations of wealth and power. And with climate change now in the ascendant, in my view, we're entering the stages of the final crisis of capitalism. But then I'm always an optimist. Because its economic logic is based on literally endless growth and places ever-rising demands on the planet's finite natural resources, life under capitalism will become unviable as resources are increasingly depleted, people are overworked, and everything made scarce, more scarce, by the impacts of climate change. The problem in the medium-term future, say the next 25 years, is that the natural resource base necessary for producing what humans require to survive will no longer be reliable, or at least what humans require at present in their consumption habits will no longer be feasible. Naomi Klein puts it this way: the bottom line is what matters here. Our economic system and our planetary system are now at war. Or more accurately, our economy is at war with many forms of life on Earth, including human life. What the climate needs in order to avoid collapse is a contraction in humanity's use of resources. What our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature. It simply doesn't appear realistic to me to imagine that capitalism can be radically reformed, even with all the political will in the world, which of course is currently conspicuous at the moment by its absence, and in the necessary time frame by 2050 or so, by which point climate science tells us that the vast majority of emissions must have ended. Turning to the sociology of climate justice, we may note that the pioneers of it include the Durban, South Africa-based scholar activist Patrick Bond, and some of the key figures in the earlier sociology of environmental justice, including Bob Bullard and my friend and colleague David Pello. Both Patrick and David are speaking at this conference. Climate justice perspectives recognize that the brunt of climate change falls hardest on the most poor and marginal peoples. These structured inequalities traverse pensioners, urban slum dwellers, rural communities, indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, women generally, and the young everywhere. The stories of climate refugees, of women affected by drought and food shortage that multiply their burdens, or Inuit populations displaced by eroding shorelines and melting permafrost are already all too frequent. In addition, whole island nations face the risk of being drowned or losing their freshwater resources as sea levels rise, posing the devastating prospects of loss of homeland and livelihood for millions of people. All this points to the reality of intersectionality at the same time that it raises the prospects for radical social change. To paraphrase Naomi Klein, to change everything, everyone must change. Following from this, the question the global climate justice movement confronts is just how do we keep warming in the 1.5, at most 2-degree range, with the might of the world's largest corporations and richest governments united in what appears to be a kind of suicidal lockstep against us? Both the depth of the current crisis and the central role played by the climate disruption that exacerbates it suggest that our activism around climate change may actually open a window to moving beyond capitalism in our lifetime. It seems evident that only a strong and vigorous climate justice movement on a global scale has the capacity to force governments to stand up to the economic and political forces of carbon capitalism. At the heart of this effort is a commitment to social justice. Capitalism, on the other hand, provides so many of its own justifications. It can organize production, distribution, consumption, and all the rest for those with financial means. And this, as Marx admitted, is a remarkable feat. Its justifications begin to fail mainly when we ask who benefits and who loses from a capitalist organization of the economy, who obtains the fruits of capitalism's gifts, and who suffers its violences. The global climate justice movement can only go up against capitalism if armed with such a critique. And this could be the basis of its conceptual and moral power to galvanize and mobilize that irresistible force that we require. It could also be argued that new movements need new theories. This is true, for example, in the sociology of revolutions, where the causes, processes, and outcomes of the great 20th century revolutions differ radically from those of the movements for radical social change in the 21st century. Here, I'd like to briefly visit some of the themes of previous work I've been involved in on what causes revolutions, and this section is titled Principles, Practices, Dreams, and Hope, Constructing Vibrant Political Cultures of Opposition and Creation. None of the revolutions of the 20th century was made without powerful political cultures of opposition, capable of bringing diverse social groups to the side of a movement for deep social change, as happened in the Mexican, Russian, Chinese, Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Iranian revolutions. These political cultures all drew on people's experiences and emotions and were expressed in complex mixtures of popular everyday ways of articulating grievances, whether in such terms as fairness, justice, dignity, or freedom, and more consciously formulated radical ideologies such as socialism or different forms of liberation theology. The most effective revolutionary movements of history have found ways to tap into all of this, often through the creation of a clear common demand, such as the regime must step down or the foreign powers must leave. The forging of a strong and vibrant political culture of opposition is thus an accomplishment carried through by the actions of many people, and, like revolutions themselves, truly powerful revolutionary cultures are relatively rare in human history. In the 21st century, the nature of movements for what we might now call radical social change, which I believe is a more apt term for this century's social movements than revolution, has itself changed as activists, reformers, dreamers, and revolutionaries globally have tended to pursue nonviolent paths to a better world, intending to live and act as they would like that world to be. That is, the ends of justice are no longer held to justify the means of violence, but the means of nonviolent resistance reflect and guarantee the ends that they seek. In this, they embody and illustrate the virtues of prefigurative politics, and in particular, horizontalist ways to realize them. Movements become even stronger when, to a widely felt culture of opposition and resistance, they add a positive vision of a better world, an alternative to strive for that could improve on or replace what exists. We might call these positive alternative visions political cultures of creation. Thus, among the differences between old and new movements for radical social change, between the great social revolutions of the 21st century and the new radical movements of this century, we find the following differences. The attempt to get away from the hierarchical organizations that made those great revolutions in the 20th century and to move in the direction of more horizontal, that is, more deeply democratic relations among participants. The expressive power of using popular idioms and memes rather than ideological discourses. The growing use of civil disobedience and militant nonviolence. The building of coalitions as networks of movements and organizations that include diverse outlooks and social forces. And finally, the salience of political cultures of creation alongside political cultures of opposition and resistance. If we're concerned about having an impact on the state of the world in 2050, then sociology will have to open itself to analyzing the future better than it currently does. In the long run, the only real systemic solution to the crisis is a broad, yet at the same time more radical climate justice movement willing to confront the root causes of the crisis, including capitalism, and strong enough to decisively cut emissions in a just way. This movement, or convergence and confluence of many movements, has to get there in the relatively medium term, say the next 25 to 50 years. In the shorter term, from now out to 10 or so years, the task is to widen and radicalize climate justice movements everywhere we can, preparing the ground in ourselves and a new generation for the longer anti-capitalist project of deep social transformation in the direction of an ecologically sustainable, socially just, and deeply democratic global future. And now, as we enter the dystopian age of, are you expecting me to say the Anthropocene or Trumpism? Well, those are other stories, perhaps for the discussion that I hope we might begin now. Thank you.